So maybe you have 9 lives, but it doesn't matter now, Mr. Kennedy. I've sent my right hand to dispose of you.
Your right hand comes off?
Ah, shit! Monsters. Guess after this there'll be one less to worry about.
Resident Evil 4 is one of the greatest games ever made, and its impact on the industry at large can still be felt 15 plus years after its release. Depending on who you ask, it's one of the best games ever made in the peak of the series, or it's when the series really started to go off the rails and its influence had a negative impact on the gaming world at large. In fact, I think some of this backlash that Resident Evil 4 gets is less about the game itself, more how it changed the industry, for better or for worse. It's a game I haven't touched in over a decade. My last playthrough was shortly before Resident Evil 5 launched in 2009. Part of me kept it that way because I held it so high in my mind, but it was time to revisit it. Depending on what day of the week you asked me, it was my favorite game, and it still remains very high up there, although now I think I prefer the 2002 remake as the best Resident Evil game. Often duplicated and imitated, but pretty much never topped. So let's hop to it. Resident Evil 4 had quite the development cycle. It went through many iterations, and there were some interesting side effects. It helped spawn the series as the birth of the character action genre, as well as an overlooked survival horror title with a cult following. Development for Resident Evil 4 began late 1999 for the PlayStation 2. Returning to the director chair was Hideki Kamiya, the director of Resident Evil 2. Shinji Mikami would be the producer. Wanting to take the franchise in a different direction, Kamiya wanted to make a very cool and stylish action game. This saw a shift from fixed camera to a dynamic camera system. However, as time went on, Shinji Mikami thought that the game was straying too far from what Resident Evil was. And in a case of excellent foresight, instead of cancelling the title, Mikami got the higher-ups to agree to let Kamiya continue with a new IP. This would turn into Devil May Cry. This spawned the character action genre, which still continues to this day. In fact, the Devil May Cry series will turn 20 this year. Another iteration of Resident Evil 4 that came about had various nicknames: Castle, Fog, Mist, Airship, which started in 2001. This version would have Leon as the protagonist, raiding the Spencer Castle and the Umbrella HQ. There would be a black fog as a BOW to deal with. While exploring the castle, Leon would encounter a woman who was subject to experiments, along with her dog companion. Unlike the first version, this was due to be a GameCube exclusive. This was part of the Capcom 5 deal they signed with Nintendo. However, the Black Fog enemy was a struggle to get rendering on the GameCube. This in turn would lead to another iteration. If a woman and dog companion in a castle sounds familiar, it's because this idea would be turned into the overlooked survival horror title Haunting Ground. I only played Haunting Ground for the first time a couple years ago on a PS2 emulator, and it's a flawed gem, and I could see why it has a cult following, something I might do a future video on. After this iteration, we have the Hallucination version, or also known as Hookman version. This took the foundation from the Castle version, but changed enemies to hallucinate that Leon had to deal with. This version was heavily inspired by the film Lost Souls. The team wanted to try a more psychological horror approach akin to the Silent Hill series. The camera would switch over the shoulder akin to the final version in various situations, and would include QuickTime events. In my videos I did on Resident Evil fan games, I covered a couple of fan games that are versions of this Resident Evil 4, known as Resident Evil 3.5. One version that you could play that came out a few years ago is Resident Evil Code Man, which I'll provide a link in the description. There's another one in development known as Resident Evil 3.5 Revival, which I'll provide as well as a link to in the description. Keep an eye on that one, it looks really interesting. However, due to its demanding technical aspects as a result of the hallucinations, the team can only get one enemy to appear in a room. This led them for time trying to make a game based around one enemy, but they didn't find it worked out. So in the fall of 2003, this version was scrapped. The next version was known as the Zombie version, which very little is known about. It was only in development for a short period of time before being scrapped. Not happy with how things were going, Shinji Mikami stepped back into the director role. This would turn to the Resident Evil 4 version that was released. It was here that Mikami decided the camera would be over the shoulder the entire time as opposed to just when aiming. They decided to set the story after the fall of Umbrella to create something that would mostly stand on its own. There was a bit of hesitation from the development team due to heavy changes. Mikami and the team saw it through. Looking at those timelines, if the zombie version was scrapped in late 2003, it looks like this version of the game that was released was worked on within around a 1-year time frame. Granted, it's not like they were starting from scratch. The Ganados were tweaked enemies from the zombie version, and they had assets already. Of course, this was much more achievable back then due to the tech being used, the budgets, team sizes, but no doubt they put in a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to get the game out. With this video, I'm playing the PC version. the Ultimate HD Edition. It's pretty funny to think that Resident Evil 4 was meant to be GameCube exclusive. A few months before its launch in January 2005, it was announced that the PS2 version would be released in late 2005. Being a PS2 owner, this was how I got to experience the game the first time around. It's a meme and running joke about how many editions there are of Skyrim, but Resident Evil 4 has it beat. As of now, there are currently 11 editions out for Resident Evil 4 compared to Skyrim's 9. A VR version of Resident Evil 4 will be coming soon, and with what leaks have shown, there's going to be a Resident Evil 4 remake, perhaps as soon as the end of 2022. Your move, Todd. We start off learning about the fall of Umbrella, and Leon, who has escaped the fate of continuing the Redfield bloodline for the time being, is off to an unknown country in Europe, which is Spain, to rescue the president's daughter that's been kidnapped by a mysterious cult. You think that they probably send a little more firepower and manpower for such a mission, although I guess they want to keep a low profile. Besides being isolated does add more to the tension and horror, but at least Leon brought some gum with him.
I have only one very important question. You got a smoke?
Got gum.
When it comes to fan polls of favorite characters of Resident Evil, Leon is always at the top by quite a margin, and I think a large part of it has to do with his appearance in 4. He's cool and confident, but he still has that dorky side about him. His quips and one-liners are still great and memorable, considering everyone and their mother have run quips and one-liners into the ground since around the time of the rise of Marvel films. Gone are the fixed cameras, we're now over the shoulder. Besides the addition of aiming, the controls are pretty much the same from past titles. Tank controls have a bit of a mixed reputation. I don't have any issues with them. While they're much better suited for fixed camera, they do just fine here. There are people who have used trainers and whatnot to get footage of the game with fixed camera angles, which are always interesting to watch. Although in the Japanese version, the portion where you play as Ashley in the castle is fixed camera angles. Why this is not in other versions, I'm not sure, although you can get a mod to change it to fixed camera for that section. Shinji Mikami admitted that he was embarrassed by fixed cameras. They used that style as a result of the technology available at the time. He actually wanted to go with first person, which did eventually happen to the series, although that was long after he had any involvement in it. We'll come across our first enemy encounter, the Ganado. I love the way he turns in this cutscene.
I was wondering if you might recognize the girl in this photograph?
¿Qué carajo estás haciendo aquí? ¡Lárgate, cabrón!
Sorry to have bothered you.
The vast majority of enemies in the game will be the Ganado. They're not zombies, but their humanity is mostly gone. Some will lunge at you, others will toss axes your way, others will try and stab you with pitchforks or knives. Later on, others will toss dynamites your way, or blow fire in your face. And very quickly, we're at the iconic village fight scene. A scene that the series has made use of in 5 and in Village, although neither of them had the same impact that it does here in 4. The game very quickly tells you it's not messing around. Instead of having this as a test later on, it throws it in your face very quickly. It's funny too, because the game does ease up quite a bit afterwards. There's plenty of room, houses to run into, kicking down ladders, and blocking doors to buy some time. It's funny that beyond another section later in the village, there's next to no use of blocking doors to buy time. I'm wondering how much pushback there was from higher-ups at Capcom to scale down this encounter so early in the game. As a series, Resident Evil hasn't been known as a difficult game, unless you're playing on the higher difficulties. Challenging, yes, but they're not known for their difficulty. It's an interesting note on the number of enemies on screen compared to previous builds. In previous builds, they struggled to get more than one enemy on screen at a time, but here, there's so many enemies on screen. On the note of difficulty, Resident Evil 4 does make use of dynamic difficulty. It's something working in the background to adjust things as needed. It'll make enemies more aggressive or less ammo if you're doing well, or it'll scale enemy aggression back and more ammo if you're struggling. This village fight section also introduces an enemy who's become a pretty iconic character in the series, Dr. Salvador, or the Chainsaw Man.
What are they planning?
Chainsaw.
There's fewer things more tense than playing to quick turn and see him quickly approaching, especially in Mercenaries mode if you're not careful. And if you're not fast enough, you'll get a pretty gruesome death scene. Resident Evil 4 has plenty of these throughout the game, both in combat here and elsewhere in QTEs, which we'll look into shortly. And with that, we get our title card.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
The game slows down quite a bit afterwards as we make our way throughout the village. We'll come across our first QuickTime event. We'll have these pop up in combat times to dodge, but there are other times in the game where they'll pop up, and if we're not careful, we'll have instant death. Too bad we're not playing as Chris here running from this boulder. He wouldn't need to run from it. Of the influence that Resident Evil 4 had on the industry, it's pretty disappointing that a lot of higher-ups decide to implement QuickTime events into other games. Now, of course, Resident Evil 4 wasn't the first game to do so. This stretches back to the 1980s when you had movie games like Dragon's Lair. Shenmue, which was released a few years earlier, or as Jeff Gerstmann calls them,
it's a fucking bullshit forklift simulator for assholes!
Made heavy use of QTEs. God of War, which released around the same time frame, made use of them too. But afterwards, it became very much a cliche in the late 2000s to early 2010s to have QuickTime events in games. Here, you could skip ahead to the moment if you do die in the past. But I have to say, some of the deaths here are pretty awesome and gruesome. In previous builds of Resident Evil 4, they mentioned taking more influence from Silent Hill, and I feel that really comes across in the soundtrack. While the game doesn't have as much emphasis on horror as previous titles, the soundtrack makes up for it. The tracks here are much more sparse and abstract, more like sound collages. There's a heavy emphasis on rhythm, much less on melody. It really adds to the tension in combat. I also have to ask, what happened to the lead composer, Misao Sanbongi? She was the lead composer here and she knocked it out of the park. But looking at her credits, she only did a few titles and left the company. She did soundtrack work on the first Devil May Cry and the Resident Evil remake, but that's it. Where did she go? The game slows down afterwards to give us some breathing room, something that Resident Evil 4 is a master of. As far as ranking games with the best pacing, Resident Evil 4 has to be near the very top. Sure, I do feel the gameplay in 5 is better, but it lacks the incredible pacing of 4. It knows when to slow things down and when to speed them up, when to dial back combat and when to amp it up. We'll meet two key characters of the game, and two characters that sadly don't get as much screen time as they earn. First, there's Luis, our Spanish amigo who helps us out. He's charming, he's competent, he works well off Leon and Ashley.
Little rough, don't you think?
And then he gets killed what feels too early into the game. Granted, he didn't need to survive the game, but I would love to see more of him. If the remake of 4 wants to give him more screen time, I'm all for it. And why he can't be played in Mercenaries mode is quite puzzling. It's not like they didn't have animations for him or assets to do so. And then there is Mendez, the big cheese, who serves as our adversary for the village portion, and gone too soon because his presence, not just his physical presence, is greatly intimidating. Plus, how could you not like an enemy with an appearance like Rasputin? It popped into my mind that in the remake of RE4, what if they made Mendez more like a pursuer in the village section? He's got the build for it, he's super intimidating. Sadly, it seems like Capcom is moving away from that, seeing in how they downplayed pursuers in RE3 Make and RE Village compared to RE7 and RE2 Make. But one can hope that in Remake he pursues us like Jack Baker or Mr. X throughout the village.
Over here, stranger. Got something that might interest you.
We're then introduced to the Merchant. It's interesting to come back to this game after playing Village with the Duke, to see the different presence that both of them have in each respective game. Plus, Leon here never talks to him outright, unlike Ethan, which is funny because Leon and the Merchant are both voiced by the same voice actor, which I didn't learn before doing this video. And of course, every one of his lines have been ingrained into the brain of anyone who's played this game.
Is that all, stranger? Thank you. What are you buying?
Let's talk about the upgrade system and the inventory. Gone are the item boxes, and instead we have the Tetris-style item layout. Key items and treasures do not count and are in separate areas. So mostly gone is that resource management compared to past titles. When that style is done right, it adds so much to the game, like the original Resident Evil, Resident Evil 2, the remake of Resident Evil 2, RE3, but can taketh away when not done so well. For example, Resident Evil 0, although that's more for different reasons. And while I prefer having that style of resource management, coming back to 4, I didn't miss it as much as I thought it would. This is due to the emphasis on the action and much less of the looping level design. There are very few cases in the game where we're going to be returning to previous areas, and if that is, that's more to pick up extras along the way. We can upgrade our weapons at the Merchant, so if you want to stick with the base guns fully upgraded, You can, but you're doing yourself a disservice when better guns become available. In that case, sell those previous guns for a high price, and then upgrade the next ones you get. Money is aplenty in Resident Evil 4. You'll find plenty throughout the game in boxes, barrels, treasures, along with being dropped by enemies. The game gives that incentive to engage in combat, and also does so by being fairly generous with ammo. Again, it's that dynamic difficulty working in the background, so you're not going to be stocked with plenty of ammo, but you're never going to be really hurting for it, at least on the normal difficulty. We get to the lake and encounter our first boss, the giant fish Del Lago. Resident Evil 4 has a number of enjoyable boss fights throughout the game, all with great senses of progression, hurdles for us to overcome, and tension, wondering how Leon is going to get out of this situation. While some of them will get fairly heavy in regards to QTEs in order to avoid damage, they offer some nice change-ups to the game, and give us some downtime to recollect afterwards. Oh, and this fight has one of my favorite Easter eggs in Endgame. With that, the village section moves to night. The rain ramps up the atmosphere, along with the music. We're introduced to the parasites that can pop out after taking down a Ganado. You never really know when this is going to happen. These are where our flash grenades will be our best friend, as they take them down instantly. Every once in a while, you'll take a head off a Ganado and they'll still walk for a bit. There's this brief moment wondering if they're going to fall down or a parasite is going to pop out. The game will ramp this up over time, and if anything, it felt the last stretch of the game had parasites pop up a bit too frequently. But it's a great addition, and over the course of the game, we'll come across different parasites that can emerge. Our next boss fight is with the El Gigante. The team was clearly watching Lord of the Rings when they designed him. On the Haunting Ground connection, this dog here bears a strong resemblance to Huey from Haunting Ground, provided you did free the dog at the beginning of the game, which if you didn't, I don't know what's wrong with you.
Hey, it's that dog.
Heading back to the church, there's a bit of puzzle solving that we need to do. Puzzles in Resident Evil 4 are mostly palate cleansers, a breather in between combat encounters. While the past Resident Evil games had puzzles that weren't utter head scratchers for the most part, it did feel like they simplified them a bit too much here. I could see why with the greater focus on action, but it's not like players would have shut the game off due to having something more difficult. There was only one that really caused issues during my playthrough, and once you figure it out, it could be done super quickly.
Ashley.
Don't come!
Hey, take it easy.
With that, we finally meet Ashley. Coming back to Resident Evil 4 over a decade later, it feels like her reputation has been a bit of a victim of the Mandela effect, or people greatly overstate her annoyance. She's been known as annoying, to get in the way, that escort missions are always terrible, and she's a perfect example of it. Sure, she can be annoying, but her bratty personality and how she warms up to Leon as the game goes on is enjoyable to watch unfold. If she gets grabbed by a Ganado, you'll know right away with her yelling, and you'll want to stop it quickly by shooting at them. The most annoying parts I found were in areas where you need to rescue her and reunite, when she's constantly yelling, "Help me, Leon."
Help me, Leon!
As far as escorting goes, you could do a lot worse. When she follows you, she's right behind you. She's not wandering off and getting stuck with pathfinding issues. She'll duck down in combat encounters as well, so you really have to go over your way to end up hitting her by mistake. You'd also order her to stay or hide in conveniently placed garbage containers. And the way people have talked about her over time, it comes across that she's with you the entire game, but we'll have long stretches where we don't have to worry about her. She gets recaptured several times throughout the game. When she is around, the game makes use of her appropriately, having us deal with combat encounters with her in mind, including one section that I consider the highlight of the game, but more on that shortly. This is one of those things that Resident Evil 4 does so well. Just that pacing and keeping things fresh, changing it up, just knowing when to do so, when to scale things back, give us time to wander around without enemies, or when to bring them back into the fold.
I'll take the girl.
Who are you?
If you must know, my name is Osmond Sadler, the master of this fine religious community.
We'll also meet the main antagonist of Resident Evil 4, Sadler. Compared to the other major villains we'll come across, he's not as enjoyable as a presence. In a way like Resident Evil Village, where Mother Miranda paled in comparison to the other lords, especially Heisenberg and Dimitrescu. We'll learn about what his plans are, and this is a good time to talk about the tone of Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil has always had that B-movie feel. It really ramps it up here and doesn't take itself too seriously. It's one of the reasons why that although the plot is pretty silly and bare bones here, it's unapologetic about it, something that future titles in the series would lack. There are a lot of dark encounters and things that we'll come across, but that's rarely conveyed in the cutscenes and the dialogue. It's much better to be unapologetic and lean into this camp atmosphere, than try to juggle between the two. We'll come to one of the game's highlights, the cabin fight. Luckily, our bro Luis is also present, and gives us one of the funnier lines in the game.
Small world, eh? Well, I see that the president's equipped his daughter with ballistics, too.
How rude! And I don't believe there's any relevance with my figure and my standing.
Capcom, whatever you do, don't try to appease the Twitter crowd in the remake of 4 by removing these kind of lines. Who cares if game journalists say they're problematic? Lean into that goofy atmosphere that this title has. Be unapologetic about it. This is the last time the game makes use of blocking doors with objects. Having to juggle back and forth between the floors and various entrances as they become flooded by Ganados. Luckily, the game also keeps Ashley hidden, which was the right choice, as we're in such a tight space as is. Plus, in a bit the developers think of what players might try, there's an amusing game over scene if you shoot Luis too many times.
Adios, Leon.
I think Darkside Phil may be the only person in the world to have ever played Resident Evil 4 who got this game over unintentionally.
Adios, Leon.
What the fuck? What happened? Huh? What the fuck happened? He killed me!
At the climax of the village, we'll encounter Mendez, the big cheese, for the last time. It's too bad the game disposes of him fairly quickly, because his presence is intimidating, especially when compared to Sadler. It's like I mentioned earlier, if they want to have him be more of a pursuer in the remake of Resident Evil 4, I'd love to see that come together. In a weird note, it's really odd that the rifle reload does so in 30 FPS. I don't know why this was never fixed, and no mods ever seem to do so. And hey, look at that achievement we get when we kill him. Leon severed that bloodline like he's doing with the Redfields. Yeah, well, see myself out. With that, we move on to the castle portion of the game. I go back and forth of whether I prefer the castle section or the village section. With this playthrough, I give the edge to the castle. It has the game's best moments, the best atmosphere, and the best pacing of what the game throws your way. So as I was scripting this video, there's a really interesting development in regards to the assets of Resident Evil 4, along with other Capcom titles around this time period. A lawsuit was recently filed against Capcom, accusing the company of using licensed copyright photos from a book and a few of their games without permission. The book, titled Surfaces, released in 1996, contains hundreds of photographs as visual research for artists, architects, and designers. The book came with a CD-ROM of the images, which required permission from the author to make use of the images for commercial use. The author states that Capcom never contacted her. You could view the whole document, which I'll have linked in the description. It has plenty of visual evidence, and yeah, it's pretty damning stuff. There's plenty of assets that they made use of in the castle section, which is why I'm bringing it up now. There's other assets that were used in other games like Devil May Cry and Resident Evil Remake. So why is this information just popping up now? Well, there was a large security breach at Capcom in late 2020. Most of the focus in the press was on the leaks of future Capcom titles and plans. Images of artwork and assets were also leaked. Some of the file names from the Capcom leak were these same file names from the Surfaces CD-ROM. Again, pretty damning evidence. So I'm curious to see how this lawsuit turns out. But back to the castle. The castle does dial up on the horror while maintaining that action atmosphere. Instead of the village Ganados, we're now dealing with the cultist Ganados. They have these very unsettling chants. And like the villagers, have different variations that come our way in different combinations and numbers to always keep us on our toes. Oh, and now we could suplex them. There are fewer things more satisfying than suplexing a Ganado and having their head explode. And there are fewer things less satisfactory when they don't. As I talked about earlier about the music, the game does make up for some of that loss in horror with the more action-heavy focus, with unsettling music that wouldn't sound out of place in a Silent Hill game. Again, what the hell happened to this composer? She just sort of disappeared. It's too bad in the behind the scenes, it doesn't go into how the music was made at all, because I'm super curious to hear how they came up with these soundscapes.
I was starting to wonder when you might notice us.
Who are you?
Me llamo Ramon Salazar, the 8th Castellan of this magnificent architecture. I have been honored with the prodigious power from the great Lord Sadler. I've been expecting you, my brethrens.
No thanks, bro.
We then meet the Castellan of this castle, Salazar. It's funny to play this after Village. Whereas that Castellan was super tall, well-endowed woman, here we have the albino Napoleon manlet. He has a different presence than Mendez in the Village. Where he was intimidating through his size, Salazar is a nuisance, a pest, throwing others in the way with him cackling in the background. And the banter he has with Leon are the best examples of the game not taking itself too seriously, and their conversations have some of the game's most memorable quotes.
Oh yes, I let our miserable insects out for some exercise down in the sewer.
Thanks. That should keep me company, 'cause boredom kills me.
I look forward to our next encounter. In another life. I have absolute control.
Well, I really don't give a damn. Rain or shine, you're going down.
I've sent my right hand to dispose of you.
Your right hand comes off?
Say whatever you please. Die, you worm!
With quick succession, we come across two of some of the most memorable moments in Resident Evil 4. Firstly, being introduced to the Garrador, the enemies that are blind, which the game makes very clear in their introduction, and by also giving us these bells to shoot. We don't encounter many of them throughout the game, but they're great tense fights, because they could take you down very quickly if you're not careful. One of the most tense, if a bit frustrating encounters in the game happens when you're trapped in a locked cage with one of them, along with other Ganados. Resident Evil 4, for the most part, doesn't mix and match enemy types. For in combat encounters, it mostly sticks to that enemy, and variants of them. That's not a criticism or a praise, it's more of a thing to note. The game does just fine as is, although part of me wonders if there were more combat sections where they mixed and matched enemy types. And shortly after this encounter, we'll encounter the water room. Everyone who played this game knows what I'm talking about. Most people dread it. The funny thing is, for me, the first time I played Resident Evil 4 all those years ago in 2005, I just barely survived the room, nearly out of ammo, nearly out of health. It was that moment that Resident Evil 4 became one of my favorite games ever. It's the game's biggest test since the village scene, throwing waves of Ganados at you, especially upon entering with everyone lined up and waiting for you. And also, you have to consider Ashley in the equation, make sure that she's okay. Then we have the section of separation where she's turning levers, while we have to ensure she remains safe, along with taking out enemies that come after us. There's plenty of open space here as well to accommodate the fact that we have Ashley in tow. Coming back to this room all these years later, it's still such a brilliant stroke of game design. Throwing new hurdles your way as you continue through to ensure you're just making by. And with that, we now have a portion of time where we're separated from Ashley, not having to worry about her. The way she gets captured and separated from us always cracks me up.
Ashley!
What's going on?
The game takes advantage of this by creating some combat encounters in small rooms with cultists wielding greater firepower. While these rooms would be very frustrating if Ashley were around, it's something that we don't have to worry about here. We eventually run into Ada Wong in a pretty goofy mid-2000s action cutscene, as the plot of Resident Evil 4 begins to open itself more and tie itself into the overall lore of Resident Evil. The way it's shot is implying that Leon doesn't recognize her until she took her glasses off.
Leon. Long time no see.
Ada.
She's playing hard to get, but we all know she's trying to convince Leon that she should be the one to continue the Kennedy bloodline. As one ship poster once said, if it's not Wong, it's wrong. Shortly afterwards, Sadler kills off Luis, as I mentioned earlier in the video, far too quickly. I would have loved to have him help us get Ashley back at various points, and later on make a sacrifice. The game could have done a lot more with him. Oh, and Leon, you could at least pronounce his name right instead of Americanizing it.
Louis! Louis!
With freeing Ashley, we now play the portion that is closest to the original Resident Evil titles, due to how helpless you are, and depending on what version you play or mods you install, you could have the classic fixed camera angles. This portion also has the puzzle that I will admit took way longer than I thought, where I had to leave the room and come back. Although as someone pointed out in chat when I was streaming the game, it's actually a very quick solution. Oh, it's only possible in the GameCube version, but you can actually take your enemies to Suplex City with Ashley. It would also been nice if Ashley said something about Luis here, since you know, she was at least present in the same room when he died, just some kind of acknowledgement. There is some backtracking that we could do here to pick up some extra goodies, including finding a revolver instead of needing to purchase it. Otherwise, it's very rarely the case of needing to backtrack compared to the looping level design of previous games and what they bring back later in the series. It's one of those compromises that the game makes, and even though I prefer the looping level design of past titles, I didn't miss it as much as I thought when coming back to Resident Evil 4. It's that strong pacing that really helps make up for it. The game throws hurdles our way with Ashley in tow that scales back the enemies, dials up on trying to throw hurdles with her into the equation. Again, I sound like a broken record. The game is just masterfully paced in knowing when to dial up and down, when to separate us from Ashley, and when to bring her back into the fold. And before we know it, we're separated again, and we have to deal with more combat encounters. We then get to encounter Salazar's right hand. This invokes some of the moments in Half-Life 2 when you have to wait for the world's slowest elevator. This can be an agonizing wait as he takes a lot of damage in order to go down. Or unless you picked up the rocket launcher earlier. This is a great time to make use of it. The game brings back the village Granados into the fold for a section. It doesn't mix and match them with the cultists. It also brings back not one, but two El Gigantes, and one of my favorite death scenes in the game, where they will snatch you from the jaws of victory. Before returning to the cultists, we have the Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom section, the minecarts. Remember You'reTheManNowDog.com, delivering memes back in the early days before memes were much of a thing? I remember one that showed some of the similarities and with the cultist chanting, and that's always what I think about, and hey, actually here it is. One of the game's most ridiculous moments will be chased by a giant robotic Salazar. Geez, talk about compensation. After constantly running away, we finally come face to face with Salazar. It's so nice for him to give us this big, obvious weak point for us to attack. When I was streaming this, someone brought up a good point in chat. Had Salazar killed Leon, what would he have done? Was he just going to hang out here in this room for the rest of his days? Could he detach himself from the wall? I guess it's true when they say manlets. When will they learn?
Need a ride, handsome?
The island section is widely considered the game's weakest section. While I do agree with the sentiment, replaying it, I didn't feel it had as big of a quality drop as I recall. While the game skews most of its horror to focus on the action, especially with the change in music, it does have some of the most tense and horror-filled moments in the game, along with the best jump scare. So when playing this, I knew this part was coming, but I thought it was in a different room, so it did actually catch me by surprise. The encounters with the Regenerators is the game's best use of horror. It has that classic build-up. We know something is going to happen, of course it does upon picking up a key item. At first we can only really just slow them down, unless you pour a lot of firepower into them. However, the best way to do so is to get the infrared scope on their rifle, which we could pick up, and with that we could see their weak points. If anything, it felt like Resident Evil 4 could have made more use of the Regenerators. Spread them out a little more, amp up how much damage they need to take out, because dealing with them is the closest that the game gets to the classic feel of old of knowing when to run, temporarily damage, or kill. This could make for an interesting multiple pursuers section in the remake. Of course, those movements, the music, and the sounds they make put you on edge. And don't forget near the very end, this body bag. This is one of those moments I've always remained in my mind. What's in there? The game makes the right choice in not showing what's inside. One of those cases where your imagination will create something far more frightening. The game also mixes up how much we'll be escorting Ashley and then having her recaptured. It doesn't feel like a case of, oh geez, you klutz, you got captured again. Instead, it's more of a, here's a section where it's just you, and then it's just Ashley.
No way, Leon.
Way?
Are you out of your mind?
I knew you'd be fine if you landed on your butt.
You...
Been a long time, comrade. Krauser.
Well, that encounter Krauser in the QTE knife fight. I remember back in the day when I first played this how cool this felt. Even though these QTE battles did become a cliche and luckily fizzled out in the mid-2010s. Well, I was streaming the game and capturing footage, so I mentioned that Krauser wouldn't feel a place in the Metal Gear series, and that stuck with me. He really does feel like someone that Snake or Raiden would fight.
You may be able to prolong your life, but it's not like you can escape your inevitable death, is it?
And then there's the laser room, which is their tribute scene to the first Resident Evil film, but made it a little more video gamey. Oh, and the decision to just sit in this chair here, great choice, Capcom. Some of these last action-heavy combat sections drag on a bit too long, and this is where the game seems to pull from most when it came to future titles like Resident Evil 5 and 6. Although we do get a brief period of time where Mike, our buddy pilot from above, gives us some help before being shot down. Even though we don't actually get to see him, his short conversations with Leon are enough to make him an endearing character. Alas, like pretty much every pilot in the series, he's gone before we know it.
His name's Mike. You're looking for firepower, you've come to the right place.
Thanks. When we get out of here, drinks are on me.
Yeah, hey, I know a good bar.
Mike!
Ashley and Leon finally get cured of the parasite. This is something the game could have made more with, could have implemented into the gameplay somehow in dealing with the infection. How they would have done so, I'm not quite sure though. There could have been a lot more consequences of being infected by a parasite, beyond just having a few cutscenes. It's not really focused on, it's more of a, oh yeah, we can just remove it now, it's been there. Something I hope the remake leans a bit more into. Oh, and you know these sounds that Ashley make here have definitely been made use of by Coomer creators.
You okay?
The final boss against Sadler is fine, there's not much to say about it, and there's the Devil May Cry similarities with the ending of Escaping. One of the more game's iconic lines. Don't you dare think about cutting this one, Capcom.
So, after you take me back to my place, how about we do some, overtime?
Sorry.
Somehow I knew you'd say that, but it doesn't hurt to ask, you know?
Hey, Hunnigan, no glasses.
Forget the glasses. What's the status of the mission?
I've rescued the subject. We're returning home.
You did it, Leon.
Thanks. You know, you're kind of cute without those glasses. Give me your number when I get back.
May I remind you that you're still on duty?
Separate Ways, in a way, is like DLC before DLC existed. This was a PlayStation 2 exclusive when the game released in late 2005. Since I had a PS2 and not a GameCube, I got to experience Separate Ways. Though here's the thing with the PlayStation 2 version. Unlike the GameCube version of the game, it doesn't use in-game engine cutscenes, but are pre-rendered. So the cutscenes here are very low res. I mean, come on Capcom, would it have killed you guys to do some form of upscaling here? Separate Ways helps fill in the gaps of what Ada was doing and how Wesker ties into the story as well. There's some nice conflict here of Wesker wanting Ada to kill Leon, but she keeps ducking out to keep him alive. After all, she does want to make beautiful mixed babies with him. Ada pulls off that Nikita sexy spy style with grace, running around in a dress and heels while killing off Ganados. Plus her fan kick is far better than Leon's standard kick. She does have a hookshot, but the game doesn't really do much with it. It can only be used in certain areas. Most of Separate Ways will have us revisiting familiar territory, but mixing things up with different combinations of enemies. There is a section on the island that's new with an action-heavy focus. Although not as much care was put here as the main game, it's still an enjoyable romp.
That's a large thing you have there. But I don't like it when men play rough.
There's not a whole lot I have to say about the Assignment Ada minigame. It's just the early portion of the island section, where we have to pick up some parasite samples. Ada's military uniform is pretty cool, and I do like the intro ending music. Let's talk about the minigame, the one that everyone knows and loves. Oh, Mercenaries. The minigame to end all minigames. A mode that's just fun to come back to over and over again for just one more run. In my video on Resident Evil 5, I mentioned how I felt that game's Mercenaries was the best iteration. However, while playing RE4 for the first time in a decade, I actually think this version is best. There may not be as many characters or as many stages, but I prefer this cast of characters and their differences, and the quality of stages. We could play as Leon, Ada, Krauser, Wesker, and Hunk, each with their own unique layouts and melee attacks, and fitting music to boot. I haven't mentioned it all yet in this video, but Resident Evil 4 was still in the classic mold of pausing the game to manage our inventory and switch weapons, compared to Resident Evil 5, which would do so in real time. Usually, it's just a 2-second process and you're back into the game right away. I am surprised that there's never been some kind of fan mod that allows you to switch between weapons in real time. One of my favorite moments from years ago was when I first played the level with the giant chainsaw wielder, climbing to the very top thinking I was safe, only for him to jump up and take my head clean off right away. As I mentioned in the intro of the video, there are people who are critical about Resident Evil 4, less about the game itself. Although there's plenty of valid criticism there, it's more about the impact on the future of the series, on survival horror, and the landscape of gaming as a whole. I don't think many people will argue that prior to 4, the Resident Evil series was getting a bit stale and needed a change up, and that's what Resident Evil 4 was. However, in that change, many things were greatly reduced or outright dropped from what had been, up to that point, the core of the series. Gone was the looping level design of slowly unlocking your way forward. Mostly gone was resource management. You didn't have to think about what items to take with you from your item box, which Resident Evil 4 discarded. Gone was wondering if you should take down that enemy or run past it in order to save ammo. Resident Evil 4 pushes you to take down all your enemies to collect money and more ammo. And on the horror side of things, I don't think the horror was as downplayed as it's made out to be. There's still plenty of dread and tension in the air, and some really great scare moments. The following 2 sequels, Resident Evil 5 and 6, would be the ones to greatly push horror into the background, till nearly 12 years later, after the release of Resident Evil 7, that saw the series return to its core design that it began with. Resident Evil 4 saw a major shift in the genre of survival horror. The original Resident Evil helped kickstart the genre that saw many fantastic titles on the PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2 line of consoles. This is widely regarded as the golden age of survival horror. And while there were still a few more excellent survival horror titles that came out after Resident Evil 4, the survival horror genre mostly faded into the background during the PlayStation 3 generation of games. Silent Hill 4: The Room, which released just a few months prior to Resident Evil 4, was the swan song of Team Silent, before Konami put the series into the hands of Western developers to diminishing results. There were some action horror titles that came out in the vein of Resident Evil 4. My prior video to this one was on Dead Space, the best example of a game that came to closest in getting what Resident Evil 4 got so right, in some areas even surpassing it. Resident Evil 4 was the last game in the series that Shinji Mikami would work on. He would take another crack at the survival horror with The Evil Within in 2014, Although I've never played it, common consensus is that it's a good game, but nothing outstanding or groundbreaking. It was the indie titles like Penumbra and Amnesia in the early 2010s that would bring the aspects of helplessness back into horror. And eventually Resident Evil would return to this many years later with Resident Evil 7. Silent Hill series was looking to go this way as well, before Konami, being Konami, pulled the plug on the Kojima Silent Hill title. Not only did Resident Evil 4 have a major impact on the series and survival horror titles, but the gaming landscape as a whole. While it wasn't the first to use the over-the-shoulder camera view, it's one that set the standard that's still used to this day, in many variations. It helped lay the foundations for titles like Gears of War and the rise of the cover shooter in the late 2000s and early 2010s. It set the template for the quote-unquote PlayStation exclusive that's still used to this day. While it didn't create them, the heavy use of QTEs and titles that followed were no doubt influenced by Resident Evil 4. This is one of the more ill-advised design decisions that luckily have faded into obscurity. So while Resident Evil 4 does have a factor in how some of these trends did play out, I do feel that people put more hate on the title than it deserves on that front. It was and still is a fantastic game. It's just that most developers tried to copy with it without understanding why the game works so well. That's their problem, not Resident Evil 4's. So I've talked about it here and there throughout the video, but let's focus more on this upcoming remake of Resident Evil 4. From the leaks, there's been some interesting information on how it's been playing out. Due to the criticisms that the remake faced, Capcom's A team has been shifted to work on this, with the B team taking less of a role, and it's looking to stick more to the original. If they could do something along the lines of how RE2make was, I think they'll be fine. Keep that campy atmosphere. It'll probably be more in line, of course, with the series has gone with 7, Village, the remakes. But I think they've learned here not to really muck with the tone. Don't turn Ashley into a swearing machine like they did with Jill in the remake. Don't water down the dialogue because it's quote-unquote problematic. Please give Luis more screen time, keep him around longer. I'd love to see sections with pursuers, like Mendez pursuing us at various points throughout the village. On the QTEs, while I still love those deaths, you could cut them out of the game. Not the death scenes though, find some way to include those. I think the stakes are also much higher for getting this remake right compared to 2 and 3. There's many eyeballs on this one. While they have had some stumbles, Capcom has done a mostly great job with continuing the series with 7 and Village, did a great remake with 2, seems to have learned their lessons with how they handled 3. So I'm cautiously optimistic about how this will turn out. So that's been my video on Resident Evil 4. I hope you've enjoyed it, everyone. Like, subscribe, comment, you know the whole thing with the algorithm. If you'd like to support the channel further, please check out my Patreon, which I'll link below. Get access to my weekly newsletters. You can be featured in the credits here thanks to Tier 3 supporters. Get access to videos early. Thanks for watching, everyone. Boulder Punch out.